Hello, boys and girls. Hope you are doing well, and everybody in your family um, staying healthy, not mixing. Um, Welcome to the three of our online classes. So Monday we started off talking about the Second Great Awakening and how that was a wake-up call for America. Um, uh, Christians and women were behind the reform movement. But the beginning of it all was with the Second Great Awakening. So the Second Great Awakening led to all the reforms that we're going to eventually talk about. Yesterday we talked about the education and prison reform. Uh, Today we're going to talk about abolitionism. And when you hear the word abolition, think about to get rid of slavery. But in this regard, it means to get rid of slavery. Um, we've been talking about slavery from the beginning of this class. The first enslaved persons came to the Americas in the 1600s. So that issue had always been there. But in the 1800s, it gained a new momentum. People wanted to get rid of it because it was against America's principles. So let's get started on that. Again, make sure you are taking notes as I go through this PowerPoint because on Thursday you have a quiz, and on Friday there will be a project. So you need something that will help you, that will give you some information. So make sure you are following this PowerPoint, taking notes as you go through them. All right. So this movement or this reform movement is known as abolition or abolitionism. It's the same thing. And in this sense, if you look at the star, it will come up eventually. The goal of the abolitionist movement was to end slavery and racial equality for everybody. Um, Now, who were the people behind this reform movement in the 1800s? Now, if you go back to the 1700s, we actually talked about the Quakers. The Quakers were the first group, religious group in America to call for the end of slavery. So that was in the 1700s. But like I said, in the 1800s, um, the issue of abolition gained a new momentum. And some of the people, there were a lot of people behind this movement, but some names that we need to know here for our class was a newspaper, like a journalist from New England, I think Massachusetts. His name was William Lloyd Garrison. Um, he was very opposed to any form of slavery in America. He wanted to get rid of it. For him, slavery was against America's principle, and there was no room for it. It was no more compromise. For him, slavery should end now. All right. Another name was Frederick Douglass. I'm sure you might have come across that name in some of your readings. Frederick Douglass was a former slave who escaped uh, to the North um, and then learned to read and write and became a very vocal leader in the abolitionist movement. In fact, many people do not believe that he was a former slave because he was very articulate. Uh, he could read, he could write, he could speak very well. He was an eloquent speaker. So many people did not believe that he was a slave, or if sorry, a former slave. Um, uh, so he had to write a book. He actually wrote an autobiography about himself. Um, I think the name of the book was um, Frederick Douglass, an American slave. Um, Now, what were some of the things? Now, some other names that were in this movement include Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was another former enslaved person who was able to escape from the South and move to the North. I think she actually moved to New York. And then she became a voice, not just for abolition, but also for women's rights. And you see from the PowerPoint right here, I have the Quakers. I already mentioned them. We actually talked about the Quakers a while back. The Quakers were the first religious group to call for the end of slavery in America. They believed in inequality. They did not want anybody to be treated less than. All right. Now, what were some of the things that these different bodies did to bring about the end of slavery? William Lloyd Garrison published an anti-slavery newspaper. It was called The Liberator. Now, if you look at that word liberator means someone who frees. It's from the word liberty. Liberty means freedom. All right, so that was what he published to make his opinions known about slavery and the activities of abolitionists in the North, and in fact, all over the country. Frederick Douglass also published a newspaper. His own newspaper was called the North Star. So it was about sending anti-slavery messages all over the country, even maybe sometimes even to Europe. All right. A woman that I'm sure many of you have heard about that was very prominent in the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. Now remember, the Underground Railroad was not a real railroad. It was a secret net of routes that would get people from the South all the way to the North. In fact, the North was not really safe for enslaved or escaped enslaved persons. Many of them had to move to Canada because they actually passed a law. It was called the Fugitive Slave Act. That law made it possible for Southerners to go into the North to recapture their slaves. So the North was no longer safe. So the Underground Railroad actually extended all the way to Canada. All right. And like I said, Harriet Tubman is the best or was the best known conductor of the Underground Railroad. Now, let's watch this clip and maybe you will get a different perspective on this movement.
The abolitionist movement began in Europe in the 18th century and eventually spread to the United States. Between 1777 and 1804, northern states passed gradual abolition laws, and in 1807, Congress banned the importation of enslaved people. But these efforts did not affect the slave trade within the U.S. Southerners, in fact, rejected any form of abolition and only intensified their focus on slavery as they pursued the continuation of slavery to reap the profits from cotton production. Abolitionists consequently pushed for an immediate end to slavery, sending petitions to Congress, organizing boycotts, and circulating media that condemned slavery. Two of the most prominent abolitionists were journalist William Lloyd Garrison, who published the abolitionist newspaper The Liberator in 1831, and Frederick Douglass, a former slave who presented his first-hand account of life as a slave to large crowds and published the popular autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Despite their efforts, abolitionists faced two major obstacles. First, abolition destabilized the already fragile balance between the North and the South. Second, many considered slavery a matter of states' rights and viewed federal involvement as unconstitutional. The tide began to turn in the 1840s, though, as Northerners increasingly wanted to keep slavery out of the Western territories. Also, Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, stunned readers with graphic depictions of slavery's cruelty and sold over 300,000 copies in its first year, encouraging many to support the abolitionist cause. The United States women's movement grew out of abolition, but was not immediately successful because the public's focus on the anti-slavery campaign left little room for other causes. Many early supporters of women's rights also advocated for abolition. Lucretia Mott, for example, played a key role in the anti-slavery movement, but she also helped found the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, which fought for equality for women and African Americans. Ironically, women faced discrimination within the abolitionist movement. While Garrison's followers fought for equality for African Americans and women in the American Anti-Slavery Society, splinter groups formed, such as the Liberty Party, which limited women's ability to participate, and the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, which barred women outright. This discrimination led women's rights leaders, including Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to organize the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Also called the First Women's Rights Convention, Seneca Falls attendees drafted a Declaration of Sentiments modeled after the Declaration of Independence and listed their demands for equality, including the right to vote. Ultimately, though, women's equality took a backseat through the Civil War as activists focused their attention on abolition. Nevertheless, the women's movement would come to the forefront in the latter half of the 19th century.
All right, students, hopefully you have a better grasp of what the abolitionist movement was all about. Key things to remember: it was a movement to end slavery. Some key names involved in this movement was William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and of course the Quakers. All right, and some of the, newspapers that were published to promote this reform was the one by William Garrison called The Liberator, and the one promoted by Douglass called The North Star. And don't forget the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was very instrumental in bringing an end to slavery, or helping escaped enslaved persons move to the north, or like I said, move to Canada. All right. Now I see that many of you have done day 1 and day 2. Those of you who have done it, I want to say thank you for trying to do your work in these very difficult times. But I want to make sure that when you are doing those assignments, make sure you watch my video first, read the passage before doing the quiz. Now, don't manufacture answers from your head. All right, make sure your answers come from the passage. All right, because I'm seeing some very weird answers, and it tells me that you are either not paying attention or you are not reading. So make sure you watch the video first, read the passage, and then answer the question. If you're not sure about what the question is asking you, go back to the passage and read again. All right. Now, I think in all quizzes, I've given you guys up to 3 attempts to do it. So make sure you use all 3 attempts. All right. Again, if you have any question, you don't understand something, feel free to give me, shoot me an email. Like I said, I check my email periodically throughout the day. I will definitely get back to you as quickly as I can. All right. Stay healthy. Read. Help your parents at home, and stay out of trouble. Until I see you guys on Thursday,